Psalm 90, the first psalm of book 4, a psalm of Moses. I
Your
heard that,
boy Moses?
yep, I read that this is the oldest psalm in the book of Psalms. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm down with that. I could see that being the oldest psalm because he seems like probably the oldest of the authors that we've seen so far.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it made sense to me too.
You know what? This is another one that I read, and I I felt less inclined in my reading to go, I got to figure out what this says, and I got to think of something to say to someone about it. And I really just enjoyed, like, it's a very poetic psalm, with lots of metaphors. And I think what I thought was really beautiful, like if I had a highlighter in my Bible or a pen or pencil to underline some verses, I probably would have like underlined slash highlighted verse 12 through 17. Um, and I like how the Message puts it. Oh, teach us to live well. Teach us to live wisely and well. We've been looking at Jesus giving final instructions to his disciples in John, teaching them to live well and what's to come. Come back, God, it says in verse 13. How long do we have to wait? Kind of funny that they're about to experience this similar, like Jesus is leaving, but then he's going to come back in the form of the Spirit. Then verse 14, surprise us with love at daybreak, then we'll skip and dance all the day long. I love this. It's a reminder that while the most important thing is to get in the scriptures, there is something about reading them the first thing you do in the morning to really set the tone for the day. Then verse 15, make up for the bad times with some good times. We've seen enough evil to last a lifetime. Thinking about Moses and his context, they were enslaved, for years. That's all he knew. And then he was in a desert for 40 years just to be prepared to lead them out. And then he went back to the desert for, I don't know, is it another 40 years? you know, um, but then this kind of ending here, and let the loveliness of our Lord our God rest on us, confirming the work that we do. Um, it's that reminder that Jesus does say in the end, the day that we long for to reach, well done, good and faithful servant. Um, yeah, I don't know. I loved just, again, just the poeticness of this psalm and how it's beautiful um, and, and, and yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Jake?
That's awesome, man. Yeah, in a similar way, I found myself just like rereading parts of it over again just because it's really cool. And the more I read, I felt like the more I realized that there was a lot going on.
Yeah.
Um, because he starts off and he talks about how God has been there forever before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world from everlasting to everlasting. You are God. And so like there's this stuff about God reaching way back, but then in verse 8 it zooms way in and he says, you have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. And I'm just like, oh, that's an interesting turn. um
The grandness to the minute.
yeah, and even just like the wonderfulness to
Hmm.
the grossness of the sin. And then it gets really like it's a total bummer for the next couple of verses. That. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. He says,
Maybe we'll get 80 if we're lucky.
80 years, but the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they pass quickly and we fly away. And I was just like, oh my goodness, wow. That's never like what you want to read. But then, like you mentioned, there's this beautiful ending, and like this shift takes place. And I liked in verse 14 where it says, "Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days." And I just thought that that was an interesting contrast because
Yeah.
first, after talking about God and how he's been there for all the generations and everything, once he goes into sin, life becomes a bummer. And then there's this shift where there's in a sense like this restoration, because he's talking about wrath, he's talking about judgment, he's talking about the result of sin, and that's where he gets to the best of our 70 or 80 years is trouble and sorrow. But then he talks about God having compassion and
Mm-hmm.
being satisfied with God. And I love that, because when we look to the world and when we look to sinful stuff to satisfy us, ultimately, even though it looks good, it's not good, and it leads to trouble and sorrow. But if we look to God to be our source of what satisfies us, all of a sudden, life that was troublesome and a burden and a bummer, there's this opportunity where the same days that he was saying the best of them are full of trouble, he says, we sing for joy and be glad all of our days. And I just love that contrast. And really, that's the contrast of being in sin and without God, or being redeemed and close to God.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that. And that doesn't mean that we're never going to have bad days. But what it does mean is that we have joy and there is gladness in Jesus. And so I don't know, that was just really, really cool. And then I guess the only other thing that stood out was, I think you mentioned this part too, but verse 12 where he says, teach us to number our days. I think you said the message said something about like, teach us to live well.
Yeah.
And I really liked that, because what he does in this psalm, zooming out to the grandeur and glory and bigness of God, and then showing how small we are as people, it just made me remember and realize that, like, man, it seems like a long time, coronavirus right now, or life in totality or whatever, but ultimately in the grand scheme of things, our life is like a vapor. And so to have my aim not be for this life, but to live well for him and for heaven and for eternity is a pretty cool reminder too. So lots of stuff packed into this psalm. It was a good one.
Yeah. Well, let's end with this verse 16. Even we didn't mention, but it's a good one. Let your work be shown to your servants and your glorious power to their children. Or the message, let your servants see what you're best at, the ways you rule and bless your children. Be blessed today. All right, brother.
Hi, dude. See ya.